up it.
First of all, I just want to say happy birthday, San Diego Watercolor Society.
60 years of a volunteer organization is really a milestone. And you think about that's people who stepped up without getting paid to volunteer to keep an organization running for 60 years is really, it's inspiring.
All
It's really
grassroots.
inspiring.
Grassroots. And one of the things I wanted to say, you can see our email on the screen here. And if anything that you see in this piques your interest, just email us and we'll send you a PDF of whatever it is we're doing today. So if things go by too quickly, don't worry about it. You can pick it up later yourselves.
And the other thing, when a plane flies over, we'll just stop until we can talk again, so that we're not competing with the airplanes. So, okay, watercolor and water media then and now, with a focus on Western European and American art.
So, go ahead and go to the first one. So that, one of the things I think we can agree on is that writing and painting is about communication, right? So this is what they were doing. The paper was not invented, obviously, so a cave wall does just fine. So one of the things, before we go, I just wanted to read an excerpt from my charcoal drawing book, which I did in the 90s, because I think it sums up things pretty well. The other thing is, they used charcoal, and up until about the 16th century, there was no graphite. So watercolorists, anybody doing watercolor, was charcoal or just going in with paint.
Or ink.
Or ink. Charcoal drawing is as old as the discovery of fire. When primitive people sat around campfires, charring sticks of wood and drawing on flat stones, they were practicing the art of charcoal drawing. Today, charcoal is still made the same way. Vine, willow, and other twigs are charred in hot ovens for use as vine charcoal, which is charred coal, the type most commonly used by artists. In addition to vine, there are also pencils and compressed charcoal sticks that come in varying degrees of hardness. Both beginners and professionals appreciate the rich expressiveness of charcoal. I used charcoal when I first started drawing, and it is still my favorite sketching medium. So, back then, you can imagine going on a hunt and just getting your red oxide, your hematite, your manganese oxide, and talking about what you did that day, and there it stays until today. And one of the things that's beautiful about it is it's still around because it's in the dark, and that's how you best preserve watercolor, is done that way. So in Egypt, one of the things that when they developed papyrus and that kind of paper, there was no such thing as sizing, and it was mostly done for just to transmit who's who, who's higher and who's lower, and to do the kind of communication they did. And so it was very primitive, but it was basically outlined, because there is no such thing as blending at this point, and they also use body color to a large extent. And then in China, it all began to change. So they began to develop paper. They would use old nets, or they would use mulberry, and they created a paper that was very absorbent, and they also worked on silk. And the other thing they did was they started to notice nature, and they started to depict these beautiful areas like that. And you can see that in a lot of their works. But the one thing about it was that it was very fragile. This same paper that we do soumier, this is mulberry paper. Their paper was very much like this. So it was very easy to, you could Like, when I'm working on this, I just take water if I want to cut it and just pull it apart. So. And then the evolution of opaque body color. And in India, once again, it's like mostly for manuscripts, and they worked on parchment because parchment could hold this. Did you want to say anything else about parchment?
Well, so the parchment, that started to be more European, Western water media influences, working on parchment paper, whereas in Asia it was more on the mulberry paper, and you could really start to see there's a real split, you know, where the river divides in terms of how the East deals with water media and what's going to be happening in the West in terms of how they deal with the creativity of water media.
So then, let's see, going back to Fabriano in about 1264, the paper mills, and they began to actually make paper, and they developed the art of being able to size the work, which makes all the difference in the world. Does anybody know what sizing is? And by the way, feel free to, if you have questions.
Sizing that?
Yeah, sizing, it's like a gelatin. It can be animal products, whatever it is. One of the things I remember in painting on Arches paper, that especially in the older days, when you start to wet it, it starts to smell. And that's because of the sizing on it. And one of the reasons paper became so prominent in Europe is because they had so many rivers. And they could build a mill on the side of the rivers, and they could get water, and they started experimenting and making the pulp.
And there was a difference between sizing being made with the paper versus sizing that's just laid on top of the paper. So.
Or they would dip it into the sizing.
And so that, like, there's a real difference. The reason why paper, expensive paper or professional grade watercolor paper, it really has a lot to do with the sizing and how that's made. Like, student grade paper, which even as a student or an amateur or just beginning person, really should never use that kind of paper. Because you would never get the experience and the appreciation and the joy of working with watercolor if you're using student grade paper.
There's no sizing, there's medium sizing, and there's hard sizing. And it's like Strathmore student grade, it's got hard sizing. So if you try to glaze on Strathmore student paper, sure, it lifts easy, but you can't glaze because it'll lift everything that you just did. So that's one of the reasons I always try to tell my students, don't use student Strathmore, because then you'll draw like a student.
So in the East it was mulberry, they made the paper up, and in the West it was cotton?
Cotton.
Cotton.
Yeah, cotton and linen. You know, it really changed everything. And cotton is pure white. It's 100%. It's acid free. I mean, it's in the middle of the spectrum between alkaline and acid. So it's the best thing to do, but it costs more. But it's very white.
So if you're an instructor and you teach watercolor, really it's worthwhile to advise your students to really go ahead and buy professional grade watercolor paper. And because
Maybe you let me get a few strokes in.
you really want your students to have a good experience. You
Yeah.
want to have a good experience teaching them.
So this is what happened once there was sizing and people could actually draw on paper rather than having it just absorbed. This is what you got, was beauties like these. Okay, so that takes us into Albert Dürer, who we think he was kind of like the father of watercolor in a way, because he was able to, first of all, use the paper that had sizing on it, but a lot of this was probably toned. And you can see he's still doing a lot of drawing, but look at the individual strokes. I guess this is what happens when you don't have television and you have plenty of time on your hands.
So he's which is a body, it's called, and a lot of old books on watercolor or about art, they'll reference oftentimes body color. And what is body color? Body color is an opaque white paint. And that, you know, now we never use the name body color. Like, why would you use that? You would say, you know, white paint or.
So this is just a little bit more of his work. These are watercolors. You can see, the thing that's interesting about him is that he loved nature, and he was curious like Leonardo in a way, and just went out and did these things. So those of you who are going to be taking my bird class, see if you can do that. I mean, that's incredible.
And so if any of you were at the lecture on that Ken gave for the to cover the PDF and the anatomy of birds, and he went over quite well the primary, secondary,
Tertiary,
and
just like the color wheel.
what was the name of the
Scapulars.
Contours?
Oh, coverts.
The coverts.
Yeah, primary and secondary coverts, which are those part, the green part, and the alula, which is the thumb.
So the coverts are called coverts because they're covering the primaries, which are the blue and the white feathers. And so that's...
This is a lilac roller, by the way. It's amazing, you know, he just pulled off a wing and he said, hey, it's so beautiful.
But they, you know, that's like very natural then, actually.
So Anthony Van Dyke kind of pioneered the use of translucent washes. So this is the beginning of watercolor in a way. This is what it looked like at the start.
So artists oftentimes were using their watercolors as just studies for oil painting, because oil painting, watercolor actually has always kind of been considered the stepchild to oil painting. It's never been held to the high esteem as oil painting, and artists would go out in nature and take their watercolors because it was easy and do studies and then come back in and have that information that they would use to then add to their oil paintings.
So this is actually more typical. This comes out of the Brown School of oil painting. And so instead of getting into a lot of color, some of these artists coming out of the Brown School, which means that they used to start with an underpainting of burnt sienna or burnt umber. Well, it was mostly about values, which we all agree is the most important part of painting, but these are really good examples of what was being done there.
What is it? Value does all the work, color gets all the credit.
Yeah. Claude Lorraine, though, keep that name in mind because he influenced Turner quite a bit. So Poussin, look at the beauty of that, the luminosity of the rim lighting.
So it is wonderful to see how much you can get with just one color or one value. You know, how much of a painting you can get and just going out into the field with just one color. So
And
you don't have to like pack a whole bunch of stuff.
And this wouldn't have been possible without sized paper because it would have just blotted out. And Rembrandt even took his hand at it, doing that and doing beautiful sketch.
On the other one, did he put a wash on the whole paper first? Does it look like to you?
Probably.
It looks like it. Looks
Yeah.
like he toned the paper. Although I have to say, back then, a lot of times they were using a paper that was already toned. It was almost like the color of grocery paper. Yeah, like a grocery bag paper, you know, that you get at the store. It was kind of like that, and a lot of artists use that. And this one, though, I think was done with ink. but this one, I think
Looks
this
a
is
little
watercolor.
brushwork too, yeah. But we usually just know him for his oils, so usually at the time watercolor was kind of like a commercial artist's work. It was done for a means to an end, and something like this, doing botanicals, and it was just considered, you know, secondary to oils.
Illustration, more illustration
Yeah.
bent. It wasn't looked at as a fine art.
Yeah.
You know, it was, you're over here.
Stephanie, what is the difference between illustration, that term? Does that mean it's commercially done for a purpose, or is
They're
there a
really-
style?
You know, I think it doesn't really matter anymore. Usually illustration is done for a signs or a book, and there was a big, but if you look at the Tao's painters, they were all illustrators who became some of the best fine artists. And it just means pretty much work that you're painting for yourself, or versus something for a particular book or
Project.
project.
Yeah, so an illustrator would be a hired gun for a company, and like Disney or any kind of a company, 3M or anybody who needed an image. I mean, now actually illustrators are being put out of business by AI, because a lot of companies now just have AI create an image, and I'm sure you're all seeing that all over the place. AI images, they're just popping out all over the place, and so
I used to do illustrations for tailor-made golf clubs and stuff. They asked me to do every year Santa walking on a golf course carrying golf clubs and stuff. So that was commercial. That was illustration.
So the really American watercolor really owes its initial history to England. And the golden age of watercolor in Britain was really started in the 18th century. And that is also when the first watercolor society started, which was in, 1804. Before that, there was another society, but it went defunct. And before the societies, it was clubs. So artists would get together at clubs at somebody's house, and they'd share and show and trade
then they had
secrets.
disagreements, and they'd create a posing club. And,
Right, and then the Royal Watercolor Society was formed. It had another name before then, but now it's the Royal Watercolor Society. It's still in existence. And artists were getting so excited about watercolor that the color men, they were the manufacturers of paint, pigments, and tools for the trade of artists. They often were called color men. And they started developing special papers just for watercolorists. And so in England, it was Saunders, and I think Waterford. Saunders, Waterford. And in France, it was Arches, and then in Italy, it was Fabriano. But that is where really the specialization started happening in paper, where they started to make all kinds of different paper, hot press, cold press.
and you know, you have 140 pound, 300 pound. It just there's considered to be 500 sheets weighs a certain amount. Pound, it means that's the weight of 500 sheets of paper put together. Anyway.
So pigment is minerals. It can be natural minerals or synthetic formulations that is joined with gum arabic or some other material to make paint. Ink was often joined with oxgall bile, and that's how ink is very different than using gum arabic. Gouache was also then started to be developed. Gouache is more like a body paint. It has white in it. It's more opaque. And Chinese white was developed by Winsor Newton.
Yeah, he actually termed it Chinese white. That's where we got the name. And original whites were either lead, zinc oxide, or titanium.
So the initial cakes of watercolor came in cakes, and it was, then you just added water and you got the paint off of these little cakes.
Well, let me say one other thing about that. You know how in sumie you have an ink block and you grind it around? The pigments used to be that way. They came in a long block, and you would grind it in on porcelain or in a oyster shell, something like that, and that's how you got your pigment out. You wet it first.
And then Winsor Newton came along and, inspired by oil paint in tubes, developed watercolor paint in tubes. So we have Winsor Newton to thank for watercolor being in tubes and not in cakes. Anyway, this is what these first tubes looked like. Putting paint in tubes also then made it really easy for watercolorists to go out into the field and start taking their tools of the trade with them.
I'm reading a really good book about Turner right now, The Life and Times of Turner, and it talks about his transition from having these cakes to finally having tubes and going out. We'll go further into that. You had a question?
Earlier you mentioned cold press versus hot press.
Yeah.
Can you explain the differences?
Hot press is smooth because it actually has a hot, it goes through hot rollers and it smooths it out, so there's no texture from the screens that make them. Cold press doesn't have that. It's actually cold, so they call actually cold press not, which means not hot press.
So how does that affect watercolors? What's the difference?
It's a little bit more absorbent, and things run a little bit more than the textured paper of hot pressed or rough, of cold pressed or rough. And it's like Dean Mitchell uses a lot of hot press. He does just fine. And
It's really interesting when you look at a watercolor exhibition. It really is worthwhile to pay attention to what kind of surface that artist used to get the kind of marks that they're making. It really is something to take into consideration at the very beginning of your, when you have an idea and you're going to create something. What kind of surface do I need to use to give me the best and truest representation of the vision that I have in my mind's eye? And it really does start with your surface. Whether it's paper or there's so many surfaces now, but it's like you don't want to get halfway through your project and go, oh geez, you know what? I really should have grabbed that hot press.
but if you want to be able to show highlights on water, you want cold press or smooth, or cold press or rough paper, because you can dry brush over it and it'll land on the high spots, and the low spots will stay whatever the dominant color is, and that's how you get this lovely texture on watercolor that you don't get with hot press.
So one thing I want to make a quick mention about lids on tubes, and it's just my own little pet peeve when it comes to watercolor and oil painting tubes. I can never get those darn plastic lids back on properly, and it's so frustrating. And I do still have old tubes that have these metal lids, and I have to say they were much easier to get back on than the plastic ones. I don't know if anybody else has that same complaint. Yeah, we all do, right? Like you end up with a bunch of tubes dried up because you can't get that silly little lid back on.
And oils are worse because at least with watercolor you can wet them.
Oils are worse, but I have to say, how much time I spend in my mind thinking about an invention for of all the years I've been painting, I think that's the one thing I've spent the most time on.
Little plastic cat.
Okay.
Cellophane.
About color, I recommend everybody get this book on color. It's called Color by Victoria Finley, and she goes through the history of all these colors, and it is like a travel guide. It's such an adventure. And so if you want to know more about where these colors originally came from and is how they got to the artist palette. This is a great book to get that information.
And it's on the PDF, so if you get the PDF, you'll have all the information.
So during this time, all kinds of new inventions were being made. There was, originally there was paintbrushes for artists were made, put in quills, in feather quills. And that is how this look really came about, is that, that's the early
A
brush.
transparent ferrule with wrapping around it. Well, that's what
And
it
then
was.
they invented metal ferrules. And so, you have, it's like so exciting, right? Oh, here you are, it's an artist, oh my God, metal ferrules, wow, how fabulous. And then artists started using all kinds of tools to manage that paint. Sponges to lift off, scrapers, fingernails, razor blades. Look at here, the end of a brush. This is when they started
The
to have
tapered brushes.
that tapered brush to
Wonderful.
scrape paint or dig or make
Or
marks.
credit card ones too.
This came out much later, but this is really a great product. If you don't know about it, you should have it in your studio, this Aqua Lift. I have oftentimes wished they made this in no. And what are the things you use to clean your ears? Q-tips.
Q-tips.
Yeah, so, because I think they only make it in these little square things, you have to cut it off if you want a little tiny piece. And if they put it on Q-tips, I think that would be really fabulous, right? Wouldn't that be a good idea?
Yes.
Yeah, because you have just this little spot you want to lift a little bit, and you're trying to get like the tiniest little piece of this stuff. Anyway, so these were all things that just as water starts to become more and more used in the art
Watermedia.
world, you start to see all of these inventions just for watercolor.
Do you ever walk through a hardware store and instead of trying to buy something, look to see, what could I use that for? Besides what it's supposed to be for. So Paul Sandby, he's interesting because they call him the father of English watercolor. One of the reasons is because he also developed aqua tint. And he used white. Most of the English painters used gouache. They white, titanium white. And so when he did a painting, it wasn't so linear. It had more washes on it, and he was able to reproduce them in aqua tint, so people were able to buy it, and then the word came out about watercolor, and that's how it kind of spread. So then we have Turner, of course.
Turner really started using white. And he actually, wasn't he the one who started using white paper?
Yeah, but the other thing about Turner was he used white. In my traveling set, I used a lot of tone papers as well as a 90-pound watercolor paper, but I like to use transparent watercolor with white because it doesn't dry and crack like gouache does usually, and you can just mix it in with your transparency. It's a body color. That's what Turner pretty much did, because everything was transparent watercolor except white. So this is an interesting piece. He supposedly did this from his imagination in a very quick time, showing a young student, because he was a perspective teacher. So look at those cannons in that perspective.
So it does look like the same ship, just made smaller as it went back and turned in different directions.
Yeah.
So that is something to remember if you're creating a still life subject for your painting, and you only have one of that thing, you can always just put it in another position.
Maybe a little less warm.
Make it a little
cool here.
smaller, a little larger in your piece, like repetition, that's what we love. We love repetition.
So here's some more. This is when he supposedly had himself tied to a mast. And went through the storms and said that, if it knocks me off, at least I'll have experienced what it's really like to see weather. And then this is an example of one of his paintings, and this is the area that he painted. So you can kind of see the same rhythm in it.
know, he was really doing something outside of what other watercolors were doing as well, which is he was really starting to become much more abstract.
And he scratched out darks with a sharp point, his thumbnail or the end of a brush, or stippled over them with a hard dry brush, moved color with blotting paper, rubbed out areas of watercolor wash and stale red, gave texture to areas of color with his thumb or fingers, or washed them out with clean water. Highlights were also added in gouache. But you can see in some of his works, you actually see his fingerprints in it.
So what's inspiring, I think, about Turner too, is that he was an artist who didn't let the medium conquer him. He really conquered that medium. He forced it to do what he wanted it to do, and that really shows up in his work. And it even shows up in his oil painting. Of course, there was, one time when I was at the Tate, they had a room upstairs. It was hung floor to ceiling with all Turner rejects. You know, they were paintings that didn't make it into the floor of the gallery. Oh, you know, wow, Turner, look at that. They were almost where you could go, oh my God, as an artist, it was so great to see these paintings and to know why they weren't on the floor in the main gallery. But all of the trials and error, you know, everything that he went through to get to that other place. So I know there is a movement in the art world to burn all of your tragedies. But there is a great play called, what is it? Ecstasy, tragic? I don't remember, it's tragedy and something else. Anyway, you know, like, I think being able to see the expanse of your work from okay, this was here and now this is really great.
Yeah.
I think that's exceptional, you know, so I'm not a fan of burn all your tragedies. Yeah.
Right now, there's an exhibit at the Tate, a huge one of J.W.G. Turner, and it is online, much of it is.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I just got a notice on it.
So just go to the Tate and go online.
Yeah, go online, you'll see quite a bit of it.
One of the things that's interesting, when we were there quite a bit, we spent a lot of time in the 80s in Europe, and we would go to the, was it the Tate or the National Gallery, where they would let us in, even without white gloves, to look at all of his little watercolors. I mean, there was no, it's like, they should be spanked. You know, but we would just go in there and you just thumb through his little watercolors. They were like 9 by 12s.
So this was really revolutionary. Oh, sorry.
How big is his works generally?
The watercolors were not that large.
Pretty small?
Pretty small, yeah, just thousands of them. But, you know, his oil paintings were quite large. You can still see them.
Because he was doing a lot of these on location. I mean, he was really getting abstract. Like, this is just, you know, this is incredible, right? And for that time, a lot of other artists weren't that appreciative of him being so loose.
If you read the book or listen to the book, The Life and Times of J.M.W. Turner, it really talks about how he just loved to travel, and that, by the way, that movie about him is not very good. It made him into much more of a sourpuss than he was from everything I've read about him. Okay, yeah, Goldman is another really good one. He was so precise and his values were so strong that some people say he used a projector, you know, because they were coming out then, but he's got too much work that even if he did, it doesn't matter. Look at this piece. I mean, this is, you know, just bold, simple, four-value composition, stressing verticals and horizontals with an accent on diagonals. And the animals are secondary, but it's about animals, yet look at how it works as a whole simple composition. And Constable did these cloud studies mostly for his oil paintings. And he would go out, he was constantly in competition with Turner. They just went back and forth. Anyway, that's a whole other story. And he was an admirer of Turner, and he did a lot of oil paintings, but this is one of his beautiful watercolors, just the atmosphere, the cliffs of Dover, the white cliffs of Dover back there. And then we come to Sargent.
An American footloose and fancy-free in England and Europe. So Sargent really, he was known for doing his portrait oil paintings, but he loved painting watercolor.
He needed a break, and he would go traveling. This would be either it was Venice or in the Rockies. I think he just loved to travel.
So here's just more of his. One thing I love about this tent painting of his is just how loose it is, but yet you can see everything that's going on.
I mean, those are just brush strokes. You know how those of you who study with me, I say just about shapes. Okay, you know, they say, oh, I don't want to do a hand. It's like, it's not a hand, it's a series of shapes. Negative shapes, positive shapes. That was what he was all about. Anders Zorn, he was the Sergeant of the North. And he mostly did watercolor in the I think in about 1890 he started doing oils. But these are his watercolors. Considered a master. And did you know that Sorolla did watercolors? Yeah, most people don't. Look at that. You can see the Sorolla of the little kids in the water. Go ahead. And then Thomas Moran did watercolors, and in the United States, he's the one who brought attention to the Rocky Mountains and was responsible for the government turning Yellowstone into a national park because he showed them pictures of what it was like.
Yeah, he showed his watercolors. He took them to Washington, D.C., and once they saw that
They said, okay. See, the communication.
So here's more.
Look at this close up though. This is the, and then you can see that he was working on laid paper. Do you see the texture in it? That was pretty typical of a lot of the papers before they developed what we now know as what do you call it, a whole, it gets rid of the texture and it makes it more of a consistent, but I forget what the term is now.
No pattern.
No pattern. Thomas Moran, you're all familiar with Thomas Moran. He was a big admirer of Turner. This is done with a lot of white. A lot of people would just tone their whole paper with white. I know I studied with Bert Silverman, and he would tone all his papers with white first, and then he would go into it. And that gave it a sort of a unification, and that's where you see this milkiness. If you want to do good atmosphere, that's a good way to start.
So, you know, in terms of societies, it is interesting to note that, like, if you're a member of Transparent Watercolor Society, or you enter one of their shows, if you have any opaque paint at all, your work isn't going to get in. You know, so then that is where just it's interesting to see how societies spin off into their different into their genre of what it is they show and encourage.
And then Whistler, you know, just go around with your little paints and paint what's inside.
So this is great. So here's Whistler, a transparent watercolor, and then here he's using body color or opaque paint on top of a watercolor. So, you know, it's just interesting to see how artists are just very facile in terms of they're not just satisfied with just one way of working with watercolor. You know, they're like, hey, I need to put some figures on top. So, okay, you know.
You figure it out.
Yeah, you drop some white paint in there and you put those figures on top of your scene.
And Emil Nolde, you're familiar with Emil Nolde? One of the first expressionists. He was a member of De Broca. And one of the things that's really lovely about his work is his wet into wet.
So now you can see where art, you know, is moving into this whole other direction as well in terms of looseness and application of paint, wet into wet. That's becoming popular. It's not like things aren't quite so structured and stiff. So,
Raoul Dufy started to loosen it up even more. And Paul Klee did watercolors. A lot of times, one of the things that it is a really good way to start when you're going to do something more serious. You just do a little watercolor thumbnail. Get an idea of where you're going, the colors you're going to use, the values, and the design. Look at that beautiful Egon Schiele. You know how his line work, he's so linear, but this is an instance of being more painterly.
so here is an Andrew Wyeth, and now you have, this is something, you know, it's not loose at all, actually. It's loose, but it's actually very sincere to the proportions of the figure.
Yeah. And also, a lot of times, he did egg tempera also, so he was very good at detail.
And so this is a good example. There's some dry brush on here.
And this is Jamie.
Jamie Wyeth, his watercolor.
And then this is interesting. We just thought we would include this, Andrew Wyeth's 20 great American artists. These are the ones that he thought were outstanding. Winslow Homer.
And as we go through these, you'll start to see how watercolor, it starts to really change. So Edward Hopper,
Thomas
Moran,
Thomas Eakins.
Thomas Eakins. I know there was some controversy about him not too long ago, but I don't know where that ended up.
He's still a great artist.
Anyway, he did beautiful watercolors.
One real quick note, when he studied in Europe, he would do nudes in Europe because nudes at the time were not really allowed in the United States. It was kind of looked down upon. He would cut up his works and smuggle them in like a puzzle and put them back together when he got back home. So you can actually see some of those pieces.
So it's interesting, sometimes I ask myself when I look at some of these older watercolors, I wonder if they'd be accepted into an exhibition today, right? Like, it's a really good question. I mean, we like them for the time that they were done, and maybe because they're familiar, but I often wonder if somebody never saw that Emile Nolda or that Egon Schiele, would they accept it into an art exhibition?
This one would. Look at that foreshortening. I mean, everything about that. Good way to learn is copy the masters. That's why we teach that class, drawing and painting from the masters. It's the best way to learn. Childa Hassam. Prendergast.
And I think too, in these, you can really start to see there's more use of photographs now. Artists are really starting to use photos. Not in this one. Wet and Wet, Georgia O'Keeffe.
She was married to a photographer, so she probably looked at it anyway. They had a little rivalry.
Yeah, Arthur Dove and her. So we're really starting to see watercolor, abstraction, working with shape and form in completely different ways. I mean, the artists now are really moving. They're moving into a more intellectual experience, investigating with their art.
And you can see we're moving in toward the Bauhaus movement, and like Lionel Feininger, this is similar, kind of running shapes through objects so they're not quite so material.
Yeah, so they're not so insistent on depicting exactly what's out there. They're really starting to experiment.
And then you have Milton Avery. And I just admire Milton Avery so much, the simplicity and the things he went through. I once gave one of my students a compliment, and I said, "Your work is so beautiful. Look, reminds me of Milton Avery." She went home and looked it up. She came back and she was so mad at me. She said, "I paint better than that." It was a compliment. Charles, with his work, work, you can feel the summer heat of crickets. If you ever see his work, his originals. And it just, he could capture the sense of humidity,
Weather,
weather,
rain,
original.
original marsh. You can really start to see this American style. I mean, it's very, very different.
Painting the common man. you know,
From what was going on in England.
And William Thorne. This is, you study this a little bit and you begin to really admire what's going on, the trees, and at first it just looks like a nice design, but it's so much more than that. Morris Graves, beautiful use of neutrals, highlighting a warm accent.
This is
Familiar with him?
another, yeah, really great
Yeah,
ones.
well, you can look these people up, of course, everybody knows Miller Sheets.
Did somebody here study with Miller Cheats?
Yeah. right
Linda
there.
Dahl,
Yeah,
she studied with Miller.
master.
yeah,
Yeah,
God, he was good.
yeah.
yeah.
And, you know, those, what were the banks, the credit and loan, he did those beautiful mosaics. Yeah, there's still one in Pacific Beach, Home Savings.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he was a jack of all trades.
If you go to
He
the
was a master of all.
Yeah, if you go to the Hilbert Museum now, they restored one of his pieces and it's up on the front, it's just beautiful. And Hardy Gramacki. These are, a lot of these people were working for Disney. One thing I want to mention too about what Stephanie was saying about the English artists really influenced the American artists, but I would say the American artists of the East Coast. Now the Western artists were another matter. Working for Disney, getting out, not wanting to use white, you know, wanting to use the transparency, and that's one of the reasons a lot of them didn't get into the AWS shows, so they had to create the NWS. National League, American League.
So, the invention of water media for artists really started big time here in the 19th and 20th century. So what's interesting is that Pebeo first created acrylic paint for artists, but it was Golden Artist Colors that really took that and has just, you know, skyrocketed with art materials for artists. So Golden, so all these products from Golden, I mean, you can practically call them up and say, hey, I need X. Are you making that? You know, or you need to make that.
And they're really grassroots because in the 90s, I was doing pastel and I developed a technique of working on pumice. And the Artist magazine did this article on my work, and it's a way of describing how you can either do pastel or you can add pumice to your acrylics and make it act more like pastel, a little bit drier. And they saw that article and they asked if I would, they were just coming out with pumice gel. And so they asked me if I would do a product review. So I did a product review, and that's kind of how I ended up doing that painting, was trying out their different products. And
We have that, we brought some
We
of
brought
their
some of them
pumice
down.
gel over there.
so they're real grassroots. I mean, they really let artists come in and suggest, well, what works for you?
That's one of the things I love about art manufacturers. They're very responsive to artists. And, you know, they really, it's such a wonderful symbiotic relationship between the manufacturer and the artist. And so Golden, you know, they really, it was Liquitex and all these other companies that really came after what Golden was doing. But an interesting thing about the San Diego Watercolor Society, it was in 1998 that San Diego Watercolor Society first started to allow acrylic paintings into their society. And it was after that that the NWS, they kind of, you know, artists push organizations. They push societies along because, you know, we are the society, right? Like there would be, like that too is a very symbiotic relationship.
We're
And
the
so,
dog, not the tail.
once San Diego started to allow acrylics, it's like, uh-oh, because all artists who are part of usually San Diego or part of National, and they also enter AWS. And so in 2001, NWS changed its rules to start to allow acrylic. And then in 2002, of course, AWS isn't going to be left behind. And they changed their rules. So all of that, you know, those are bylaw rules that they have to change. And I just think it's really great how responsive societies are to all the new products that artists are using.
Except for transparent watercolor society.
They
They're holding tight.
They have a rule,
Yeah.
no openings. And so then, of course, you have the cold press and hot press. Here's an example of what those papers look like. That hot press, you asked that question about hot press. It's that really smooth one. And so you can see that's gonna give you completely different marks.
And then this is your cold press in the middle, and then it's rough. So very different, but artists always have their preferences.
And then artists also started using deepen, which is kind of a plastic.
It's Mylar, basically architects have used it forever. And I know, it's basically Mylar, you don't have to buy UFO.
I think George James really
Yeah.
made it popular. He was a fabulous artist and instructor. He went around, you know, artists have been great. They travel around the country giving workshops, sharing their secrets, their trade secrets. They don't hide them in their studio. They give it out there to everybody, and then it just
When you
is
see
so
his-
fabulous.
When you see his work from the 50s and 60s, and then compare it to what he was doing toward the end of his life with UPO, I mean, what an amazing person he was.
So if you go to Comic-Con, you know, you'll see a lot of illustrators are using illustration board, and that's a heavier board. They did a lot of their work on illustration board. And then Daniel Smith has been a major inventor of new colors. Like, they are constantly coming out with new colors, and I think that company is also unbelievably responsive. They also created this watercolor stick, which is fabulous. To draw with a stick, you know, with your watercolor stick, and then hit it with a brush, or some spray bottle or something. It's fabulous.
You guys probably all know about that already.
And then one of the most latest things that's come out is aquaboard. So, watercolor, as I said earlier, watercolors have always been the ugly stepchild of oil painting. Okay, they're tired of it, right? Like when they first started showing in England, they were put in the back room kind of, you know, because everybody was celebrating the oil paint. Well, that's why the society started, because the watercolor artists were like, okay, we're sick of it. We want our own society. We want a place where we can show our own work. And so still, even in this country, oil painting always gets the bigger dollars, right? It gets the bigger money. And so watercolors are like, okay, we're gonna start to varnish. Okay, so now that removes glass, removes plexiglass, and they're starting to varnish. Aquaboard was created, and artists are now painting their water media right on top of aquaboard, varnishing it up, putting it in there with oil paintings. Problem solved. And they're asking a lot of money for their work. Good for them.
What exactly is aquaboard?
Aquaboard it's actually, well, it's a panel, and then I think you can use flat wall paint.
I think it's kind of cradled like this on the back. I mean, it's pretty solid.
On top, and then it absorbs, it takes watercolor really well, water media, although it
different,
also, it is different, it also lifts off, so it's easy to lift off to get back to that original
What's
surface.
the name of the
It's like a
artist?
clay, almost like a
Clay
clay
surface.
texture on the top.
Yeah, but it's not clay, like clay board is a whole, is something
Who was
else.
the NWS artist who did the portraits?
Oh, what's her name?
Oh, good old, what's
Good
her
old,
name?
what's her name?
Yeah.
And then the other thing, Faber-Castell was the first company to come out with watercolor pencils, where they put watercolor in wood, and so that's another option to use for watercolor. in terms of drawing. So you can see how the color men, the paint manufacturers have really been instrumental in helping artists to just keep pushing the medium forward. And another new invention was egg tempera in tubes instead of just doing the egg yolk thing over here and then your pigment over here and combining things. So
I used to break an egg and put it in its thing and save it for a week and sit there with all my dried pigments. It's like, okay,
So
enough.
Sennelier has found a way to put egg tempera in a tube. Here's these pumice gels. Doc Martens, they're making watercolor ink, and that is another great medium for flow and fluidity and getting very bright color. If you don't know about Dr. Martin's bleed-proof white,
They do, they give it in their little package.
comes in a jar.
Exhibition.
If you need white, it's a great one, everybody. And iridescent medium. They came out with a watercolor ground that was gold and iridescent gold and also a
It was
red.
a gesso, they were calling it a gesso.
Yeah, a gesso and also a red one. And then I guess not enough people were buying it or something and they quit making it. And they were in China at the same time we were in China, and I pulled the guy aside. I said, okay, look, you gotta start making that gold ground again because nobody else is making it. And that stuff is really great. So anyway, they started making it again. And I like to think it was because of me, but maybe there was a boatload of other people asking for it too, so. The other really great invention that came about was frisket. So, oh my God.
That's Pemio too, also. Pemio frisket is some of the best.
That was developed in 1960. Like, who knew, right? Like, we think this stuff has been around forever, and it hasn't.
We used to use rubber cement.
So, and you can really see those changes when you look at that early work that we showed you from England and before, and then what's going on now. You just go, oh my God, this is amazing.
And it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay, transparent.
About that, how do you keep that from going bad real fast? Because every time I buy a bottle of PBO, it
I don't
turns
know.
to fish.
You can turn it upside down. I think.
Yeah, turn
does-
it upside down.
That helps, because it always seems like up at the top, it just gets this rubbery glump. And if you turn it upside down, I figure the glump will be at the bottom and you turn it back right side up.
Buy a small bottle.
And you can use a metal, one of those architect ink things to apply it with rather than a brush. Where you just dip it in and it holds the medium and then you
Oh,
draw.
like a ruling pin.
Ruling pen.
Yeah, ruling pin.
Yeah.
Those are great.
Thank you.
So now we wanted to just highlight some selected watercolor artists that have been quite relevant for this society, for San Diego.
We could have done a lot. I'm glad Linda's here because you have a special relationship with Rex.
Rex Brandt, he was an amazing instructor and influenced a lot of artists.
That's a beautiful painting too. I also want to thank Nick Johnson from CaliforniaWatercolor.com who let us use a lot of his images.
Phil Dyke, another very important watercolor painter, taught a lot, right? Did you study with him too? Yeah. Linda here, she studied with all of the greats. She's around at the right time. She's around at the right time.
This was your first president.
Your first president, J. Milford Ellison. Now, I couldn't really find much work of his online.
I have to say, I studied with him at Oklahoma High School.
Ellison?
He was the teacher there.
Wendy's a real local. Krista too.
Wow, that's
Wow.
fabulous. So,
He taught senior studio art.
I mean, that's amazing. He was San Diego Watercolor Society's first president. Like, here's an artist who stepped up, right? Stepped up and took on a leadership position. I think that's incredible. Bud Shackelford, another artist very involved in the community of art here in San Diego. When I was president of the San Diego Museum of Art Artists Guild, Bud Shackelford was on my board.
And in 1970, I was at City College and I was studying commercial art. And he came over and demonstrated Aquarius watercolor paper. Remember that? It's a fiberglass paper. And that was so, I love that paper. I wish I could find it again.
Can't get it anymore.
I know.
So he's not only a past president here, but he's a charter member. Frederick Whitaker, very important to the art
Mr.
community
Watercolor.
here in San Diego, wrote like I think 18 books or something. Both him and his wife, Eileen Monahan Whitaker.
This is an important one here because she borrowed one of my, as you know, I did bird taxidermy. This middle crow comes from my collection. She and I used to go back and forth. We were very close, and we would look at each other's work. And just a wonderful woman. For those of you who knew her, and I'm sure you've testified to that.
And Wendell Montague is another past president.
Montague.
Montague.
He was my master teacher
Drew.
my
right.
school days, yeah.
The Drewsker.
And Lori Lynch's high school teacher.
Is Lori here?
Is Lori here?
So he was a past president and a charter member. Robert Landry. Did you study with him too?
I studied with him.
He was always around,
Always
yeah.
around.
I knew him well.
Such,
Fabulous person.
What a wonderful guy.
such fabulous, inspiring artists, really inspiring other artists to create, make, and sharing his wisdom.
Look at that lovely little green flag.
Yeah.
Right. He didn't have to do that, but he did.
So he was a charter member. Ed Wardell,
Yeah.
past president here.
And Marie Wardell.
And Mary Wardell, they're very important artists here in San Diego. They were very involved in the art community and did a lot of teaching. Gerald Brommer.
I have to show something. This is his collages, and I'm glad Patrice is here because Patrice studied with him quite a bit when I lived in Hawaii. You were actually studying with me too at the time. But these are some of his originals before he added collage. I mean, they're so beautiful, and I'll put them up there later, but I just wanted you guys to see this. I had the pleasure of being able to jury an NWS exhibition at the Hilbert Museum with him just before he passed away. So we had some really good correspondences, but this is, talk about taking landscape to another level.
Another level and adding collage to his painting. I mean, it's so inventive, right? So inventive.
Do you still do that, Patrice? Patrice, do you still do collage? Yeah.
I'd love to teach
There's a-
that.
Yeah.
There's a book in our library about music collage.
Okay, all right.
Very
So
good.
there's a Gerald Brommer collage book.
And if anybody is interested, you should tap into Patrice because she knows quite a bit about it too.
George James, he's the UPO master. Just unbelievable. There's actually a lot of artists here who I see that are using UPO, and it's just so fabulous what they're doing. Did you have a question?
He was a fabulous teacher.
Fabulous teacher, yes he was. Anyone who was able to take a workshop with him, it was amazing. Yeah. I have to say, the generosity that exists in the art community is beyond the pale.
And if you ever want to see more of his work at the Hilbert Museum, they have about 20 of his paintings, and a lot of them are from the 50s and 60s.
Lyndon Dahl. Not only is she a past president of San Diego Watercolor Society, she is a two-time past president of NWS. And she has been an elected life member here. So another amazing woman who has really shared her gifts with the community. Catherine Chang Lu, an honorary member, her work in experimentation and using white and just collage and all kinds of different materials and combining different ideas. Bob Burridge. I'm sure almost everybody here has taken a workshop with Bob Burridge. And if you haven't, you can get on his email list. And you will
He's a
get
marketer, all right.
you will get a Bob blast every week, and he is filled with fun and new ideas and great ways to just throw paint around. He's really, really.
He does know how to play.
Yeah, yeah. If you're feeling a little bit stuck, just tune into a Bob Burridge video, and you'll be unstuck just like that. I love his carrot people, right?
Yeah.
Dean Mitchell.
Dean Mitchell, the society just hosted him not too long ago, last year, and he gave a wonderful talk.
He's as close to Andrew Wyeth as anybody's ever going to get. And John Salmon, one of the reasons I like this painting, this is frozen Niagara Falls. You hardly ever see paintings by him in this key. But I think it's really a beautiful painting.
And John is another great supporter of the art community. John, I think, where does he live? Minnesota. But he is very supportive of all the societies, not just this one, but national and American as well. And
When we were president, he was always coming in, I think for you too.
yeah.
He was always coming and supporting and contributing to the president, to the ward.
So many artists who can.
Started it, the president.
He started it?
No, the Masters Award.
Oh, Masters.
He started the Masters
Okay.
Award.
So many artists that really contribute don't even live in San Diego.
Right.
And, or they did live here and they moved and they still have that familial connection to the organization. It's just fabulous. Myrna Wacknall.
And that painting, that's a painting I did of her. Because she did a painting of me, and actually she didn't flatter me at all, and I think it might have been a little bit of a thing going on. Yeah. Anyway, we had a little fun of kind of painting each other, like a little shootout. But this is a beautiful painting of hers. She's a wonderful person.
And Myrna traveled all over the country and gave unbelievable workshops and had so many fabulous ideas. And her blog is still up. And you can go to her blog and you can read some of her ideas if you're looking for something out of the box. Roberta died.
Happy birthday, Roberta.
It's a great birthday.
And Roberta's going to give a demo after we're done. We're almost done. And
Thank
she's
you.
going to show some of the techniques that she uses, that she is going to share in hopes that you're going to incorporate into some of your work. Nell Bartlett. Nell was doing something else, and all of a sudden she got into this abstract thing, and just.
She was in my figure class for a while, and I said, Nell, your abstracts are amazing. And she kind of switched, and I think some people are not meant to do figures. She does figures nicely, but she does amazing abstracts.
And Jeff McCormick, his work is amazing. He's another artist who's very supportive of communities. He does a lot of airbrush, and his textures are amazing. And he is constantly doing incredible work with his ideas. And then
You can do airbrush with watercolor?
oh yeah, oh yeah.
I know that.
You can, if you don't want to use the tool, just use a
You
mouth
can use
atomizer.
yeah, you can use a mouth atomizer as well.
That
And then-
John Salmon does it all the time.
And
There you
then-
go, there you go.
And then Kathleen Conover, she created gesso juice. And she's also someone who's traveled the country sharing her ideas and the way she works with gesso juice. And that is fabulous, yes?
She's going to be the juror of our ice show this coming year.
Oh, wow. Fabulous, wonderful.
And
So-
teaching a 4-day workshop here.
Great.
Okay, so
You'll
if
probably
you,
learn about Jessica.
yeah, if you haven't worked with gesso juice, she really, I mean, it just can take your work into a whole other area when you learn about it. In fact, here, it was Chief Joe's that she was teaching, here's the recipe, here's how you make it. And Chief Joe stepped in and said, hey, we'll sell that for you. So you can buy it pre-made. Okay, and then Drew is our intrepid plein air painter.
That's beautiful.
Uh,
And there's Dave Lucas walking on the trail.
Painting areas of San Diego we don't want to forget, right?
Drew and I go way back. We started surfing together in '72 or something like that. So we've known each other for a long time.
His brother's an amazing artist as well.
And then here's Chuck McPherson's painting of the two art critics. Chuck is another one who contributes greatly to the society. And I had the pleasure of taking this picture of the two of them posing.
You'll never forget it.
Yeah, that's a great one. And happy birthday, San Diego Watercolor Society. 60 great years. So AWS started in 1866, NWS in 1920, and San Diego Watercolor Society in 1965.
Can you go back to the first slide with your email and stuff on it?
How about right there?
Okay.
We want to thank you all for coming today.
And I want to also show you, this is how we sometimes used to stretch our paper. This is, I have one for a full sheet, a half sheet, and a quarter sheet, and I never use them. But instead of staples, you just undo these things. I learned this from Bob Perrine, if any of you remember him. Anyway, it's got a little ridge on here, and you just wet your paper, set it in, put these things on, and let it dry and
Or
stretch.
use tape.
Or use tape. But I like the way paper buckles, actually.
So I did want to show you, this is, I make my own templates, and I use this kind of paper is how I made the templates for my letters over there on that painting, and was using iridescent gold watercolor paint from Daniel Smith. So this stuff it's fun to use. If you want to make your own templates, you can get this stuff on a roll.
We can take a quick break, and then Roberta, you
Sure.
can set up.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.